I'm Lewis Sullivan from UCL, and yeah, I'm studying the BRE's kind of community scale environmental assessment method. So I just want to give you a bit of an overview of BRE in communities for those who don't know it, and a look at the current research. And talk about some of the methodological and sort of conceptual choices I made when doing this research, and then suggest some initial findings that have come out from it. So I don't know how many people here are sort of familiar with BREEAM or something like that. Just a bit of raise, so a few people. So basically it's a standard for sustainability for urban design, and BRE in communities tries to look at that from a sort of a master planning scale early on in the development. So it's a standard, but it's applied through this sort of yeah. So you don't have to apply the whole standard. You are scored by your by how many criteria within it that you apply to. So-called balanced scorecard approach. So there's hundreds of criteria organised into sort of 40 issues, which themselves are organised into these sort of 7 themes. And I was looking through my presentation. I've actually been sort of quite critical of this, of BRE in communities, sort of the point, but I think it's important to keep in mind that actually this is an attempt to really cover a really wide range of sustainability issues and to really take sort of social and economic sustainability quite seriously in the urban environment, which is quite difficult to do. Okay, so quick look at the previous research. It can sort of broadly be categorised into 3 different types. So you've got research which introduces new standards, new kind of versions of BRE in communities. These might be for new sort of regional contexts or something like that. A second kind of group is you've got research which compares these standards to each other. So they're kind of looking for gaps in the sustainability coverage or for biases. And this research sort of finds that you have quite similar coverage. There are a few gaps here and there, but what you find mostly is different biases. And out of that, you kind of see national concerns coming through. So sort of in North America and with LEED, neighbourhood development, you see density and site location sort of coming through. That's maybe represents a preoccupation with kind of controlling urban sprawl in the North American sort of urban design school. Places where there's water scarcity, give more credits to water issues, which is quite sensible. So that brings up questions about BRE in communities, which kind of has this international ambition. It operates mainly in the UK, but also in Northern Europe and all over the world. So there's questions there as how it can be applied. And then thirdly, there's research which looks at how these standards are applied within the development. And there's really not a great deal of research on that, which is where my research focuses. And it's looking at how BRE in communities gets into developments, how it's used, what sort of impacts it has, and the perceptions of that. So quickly just going through kind of empirical work. I started off with a pilot study looking generally at BRE in communities within the development process, represented by these red stars. Didn't really look at specific case studies, but these are the developments where people were kind of associated with, so all over Northern Europe. And then my actual PhD research has narrowed its focus to look at case studies within the UK that are undergoing certification right now. And these are kind of groups around Essex, in Bristol, up in Leicestershire, and a lot in sort of Eastleigh near Southampton. And these developments sort of range from 100 houses to sort of 1,500, 1,600 homes, sort of multi-use developments. These case studies are compiled with interviews with developers and consultants, local councils and local people, sort of thing, observations at design team meetings, and sort of public consultation events, and also analysis of documents, of planning documentation, local plans, sort of the submissions from the developers. And currently I am going through that data, coding it based on a conceptual framework, which I'll touch on in a second, in a program called Atlas TI, which is sort of a qualitative assessment software. Which is great. So just kind of go briefly through this. The questions that I've sort of asked myself while coding and that have formed the basis of the questions that I've asked interviewees are based on the pilot work, the literature review, but also conceptual framework based on science and technology studies, or STS. So I won't go into detail, but broadly, SCS kind of suggests methods to analyse sort of how society or people, individuals, consultants maybe, and technical objects like brain communities interact and mediate each other's actions. Suggests tools to allow you to investigate how actors get into networks and remain there, and how they gain agency, so maybe how brain communities can force its way perhaps into established kind of development sort of procedures. And it gives you conceptual tools to study how kind of knowledge and procedures and calculative ideas sort of embedded within something like brain communities might come to influence and interact with decision making in a development. So just looking at some initial findings. So firstly, talking about how, sort of asking how brain communities comes to sort of frame what makes a good development, and some observations on the actual framework itself. So despite this kind of wide coverage, there are some gaps, and these kind of manifest themselves in three ways. Firstly, some of them are simply not really there. There's nothing sort of explicitly on arboriculture or resilience, or a lot of definitions of resilience in there. Secondly, there are some issues like air pollution or public health, which kind of are there, but only as part of other issues. So they're perhaps not fully realised. And then finally, you have credits which are in the standard, but in my case studies have not been claimed. So nobody's attempted to live up to that standard. There's credits on innovation, on rainwater harvesting. So effectively, they're not really covered in this standard. Secondly, despite kind of a focus on win-win solutions and synergy, we've heard about synergy in the introduction to this event, but also in the introduction to the standard, which is great, but it's sort of applied in a kind of an inconsistent way. So you have some elements, sort of microclimate around ecology, around green infrastructure, which are described in this standard in a very kind of tightly bound way. There's all the linkages are there, and sometimes you get credits for applying that. Other parts of the standard, they are either not there, not explicitly there, or sort of have a lot less detail. So the potential linkages between, say, governance and economy and economic sustainability is sort of summed up in one sentence. So when, say, gentrification is such a problem, questions that maybe there's the gaps there in this standard. And finally, the way that expert knowledge or non-expert knowledge really is treated in brain communities is maybe quite conservative. So although it takes consultation very seriously, there's a great deal in this standard about public consultation and sort of bringing that knowledge in. It's, in practice, it ends up being quite often to follow the kind of normal pathways of consultation. Non-expert knowledge is still quite peripheral, and people sort of experience it in a combative way, as we sort of heard from the second talk about Birmingham's expansion, rather than a cooperative way. But this doesn't happen all the time. There's one case study where they've really taken brain communities to heart, and the consultation has formed the core of this development. So there's scope within the standard for it to be multiple things, which is interesting for a standard that's meant to be measuring, one way of or a sustainable development, even. And also the way that it defines what an expert is. So for all of the issues, or a lot of the issues, we require an expert to do the work, to write the flood risk assessment, to write the ecological assessment. But the way expert is defined in BRE communities is sort of, in practice, a university-educated, sort of professionally qualified person, which sort of excludes different routes that you could get to expertise, different types of experience, or less established sort of types of knowledge, which maybe reduce risk for a development, but does it also hamper innovation? So these are just some ways that BRE communities sort of frames what a sustainable development should be. Other findings that we are thinking about is how BRE communities works within a development process and how it gets into a development and influences. One of the things that we found is BRE communities needs constant work. Even when it's required in a local plan as part of planning permission, there's still loads of negotiation that needs to go on to get it sort of formally enrolled in the project. And it's something you see with other standards, particularly. You know, if a local plan requires a British standard, then it sort of seems to be accepted. Whereas this, there's always negotiation at the start. And then once in, the assessor, which is this third-party consultant hired by the developer to sort of to run the assessment to help with the standard, again needs to do this constant work, constant calling, emails which are ignored often, reminders of deadlines for reports that go past, to make BRE communities visible in development. It's never seems stabilised within the development. The assessor is also key, looking to define what the standard is in practice. So we sort of talked earlier about how this standard can mean different things and can go a bit further with that. Because it's sort of worded deliberately flexibly, so it can be applied to lots of different sites. But this also means that the criteria, the standard, is not tightly defined. And often it calls for third parties to do that. It will call in, it will reference other standards, but else the actual criteria is often negotiated for each development. So for the criteria talking about affordable houses, it doesn't say you have to build 30% affordable houses to be a sustainable development. It says you have to negotiate with the local council a good target for affordable housing. And so what that target is can change from place to place. We sort of talked in Philippe's talk, mentioned how legislation perhaps isn't enforced in a universal kind of way. And you have here, I was talking to someone from Kirklees Council who had 400 open cases, a planning officer. They're obviously not going to be able to negotiate the same kind of affordable housing targets as somebody with an excellently resourced. Having said that, there is a perception amongst developers and consultants that this is a good thing. It's, people have a positive opinion about it, but they also kind of see that it's quite easy to do, and the influence can be limited, and that's partly because of this overlap of standards. I said it kind of brings in other standards to define the criteria. The trouble is these standards are quite often the same things that people would be using anyway. It sort of overlaps with good practice quite a lot. And it also overlaps with good local plan. So a number of the case studies, if you just followed the local plan, you could get 60%. So you're only 10% away from scoring an excellent mark, an excellent sustainability certification by basically doing the bare minimum. But this perception of ease could also be explained by partly how it is designed to fit neatly into the standard sort of development practice, and the subtle kind of diffuse way in which BREEAM and BREEAM communities seems to be working. An example of this is it's almost never reached to by consultants when they're actually doing their design work. In interviews, nobody sat down with the BRE Communities manual to look at it to do their design calculations. It's always mediated, at the very least through the assessor, maybe through an email, but through meetings, but also through spreadsheets that the assessor has made, or summaries or highlights, or sort of legal documents like the Section 106. And these don't necessarily attribute their content to BRE Communities, but they are crucial in how these standards are applied to developments. Okay. So generally, the influence can be summed up in three types of development cases. Can have influence when it's strongly integrated into the core procedures. These tend to be developments where it's taken on voluntarily, and the developer has high aspirations for this. Secondly, it can be influential when the development networks are newly forming, so when the design team is new to each other and they don't have step ways of interacting, or where the developer doesn't have experience with these kind of large-scale developments. Conversely, it doesn't seem to have much impact on developments where in-house standards are strong and they're followed, and where experienced teams and developers work together. And these are a lot of developments with kind of the national housing, national house builders. They have strong independent standards, and BRE Communities just can't break in there. Some thoughts about sort of possible answers to these questions is, how do we address the emissions in coverage? Do we start to make more of the standard mandatory, limit this flexibility? Do we make kind of these hidden themes more explicit? And do we just add in the missing ones? How do we make it more difficult without making it impossible? Do we tighten that wording? But again, how do we do that without limiting the flexibility? And do we need to look at the scoring? So currently, the scoring is always on this linear scale. You kind of increase your sustainability achievement and you get the same amount of credit. So something like reducing carbon, you get the same credits for reducing it by the first 10% as you do for the last 90%. Do we need to acknowledge that getting this low-hanging fruit is easier, and kind of encourage developers to move up the scale? And finally, is there more support needed? So there's already a lot of support for assessors. There's lots of linkages between the assessor and the BRE and these developers. But is there support needed for the other actors that are drawn in by BRE Communities, the local councils and so on? And given the importance of these mediating documents as legal agreements, do we need guidance on how to produce these in a way that makes BRE Communities more effective? That's the end. Hopefully my research can give some answers to those, but in the meantime, thank you. And